Okay, so now that we know about data types and converting data types, let's go over inputs. So a lot of the time when you run a program, I think most programs that we use day to day, they require some form of user input, whether it's an app on your phone where you have to touch specific areas and buttons or type things in, or a game where you have to press certain keys on a keyboard or a controller. Uh, Programs typically require user input. So if we're making a text-based program, Python makes it incredibly easy for us to get input from the user to use in our program. So once again, I'm going to go through two examples where you'll see how I grab user input from the user. And then there will be some questions involved which I'll answer right away, and you can pause and try to answer them for yourself beforehand. And then I'll go with an exercise at the end, which I highly recommend you pause the video, try for yourself, and then come back to the video and I'll complete it. Okay, so let's go on with the first example. X underscore input equals, and then I run the input function. And this is the key function here that grabs user input. And you pass a prompt, so a string of text that will be displayed to the user. Usually this would be the question, so I'll say enter the value of X, like this. And the result gets stored in the variable X underscore input. Now it gets stored as a string, and if I want to use it as a number, I'll have to convert it. So I'll use the float function we mentioned in the last video, and I'll convert X input into just X. Next thing I'm going to do is calculate Y. So I'll use X to the exponent 2 plus 5 times X minus 7. And then finally I'll print the value of Y is Y. So the questions here are simple. Just one question. Explain the purpose of line number 2. I'll do one more question actually. Explain the purpose of line number 4. Okay, so first things first, line number 2 here. X input equals input, enter the value of X. What is the purpose of this line? Well, our program is going to do something. I'm sorry, my microphone turned off. I don't really know why it keeps doing that, but that might happen from time to time. Anyways, explain the purpose of line number 2. So our program needs to do something with a value that we're going to use called X, right? So it needs this input from the user. So basically line number 2 goes and prompts the user to enter the value for X that the program is going to use later. And then it says explain the purpose of line number 4. So line number 4 comes right after. And this is where we use the float function to convert the input that the user provided into a float and store that result in a variable called X. So what's the purpose of this line? Well, whatever the user provided to us was a string. You can't really do proper arithmetic with strings. They have to be some sort of number format, like a float or an integer, in order to do any kind of arithmetic in Python. So what we do here is we just make sure that it's cast as a float value so that we can use it in the following line as part of our equation, right? And then we print out the value. So let's go ahead and run this program. And you can see that it says, okay, enter the value of X. And we can type here, let's just say, for example, 4. And it says the value of Y is 29. And we can run it again. And we can say, enter the value of X, 5.23. And then it gives us a value of Y. Okay, let's move on to the next example. It's going to look like this. x equals int function, input function, what's your favorite integer? Okay, that's it. And the questions are, what is the purpose of the int function in this code? What would happen if a user entered a value of 2.3 at this prompt? Okay. So the first question is, what's the purpose of the int function in this code? Well, we kind of went over this in the last example, except we used the float function. The purpose here is that we want to take whatever the user inputs as part of this prompt, we want to take that and we want to convert it into an integer format or a whole number format before we store it in the variable x. So the purpose is that we're ensuring that the value of x is an integer so that we can use it in the rest of our code as an integer. So what would happen if a user entered a value of 2.3 at this prompt? Well, let's give it a shot. If I press run and it asks me what is my favorite integer and I type 2.3, oh, it looks like we got an error. It says value error. And the reason being here is that we're trying to convert a value that looks like a decimal number into a whole number, and that's just not possible. So keep this in mind when you write your program. If the user is supposed to be inputting a value that needs to be a whole number, you can convert it to an int. Or if you want to allow the user to input a number that has like decimal values to it, then you would have to convert it to a float instead. Okay, let's move on and I'll show you the exercise. So the question is like this. Write a program to quickly calculate air temperatures in Celsius, various altitudes. The program should perform the following steps in order. First, prompt the user to input the elevation, we'll call that E, of the desired location in feet. Next, prompt the user to input the temperature at ground level, we'll call that G, in degrees Celsius. Step 3, prompt the user to input the desired altitude, we'll call that A, above sea level. And then finally, calculate the temperature at the desired altitude, we'll call that T, using the formula T equals G minus A minus E divided by 500, and display the result. Okay, so there are three parts to this. First part, when using the above formula, why are the brackets important? Second part is to create the program. Third question is use your program to determine the air temperature over the town of Simcoe, which has an elevation of 735 feet at an altitude of 5,500 feet above sea level on a day when the temperature at ground level is 28.5 degrees Celsius. So pause the video now, give this question a shot, and then come back after and I'll go through it. Okay, step 1. When using the above formula, why are the brackets important? Well, everything we're doing here, these 3 steps, it's all subtraction. And we want to make sure that we subtract these 2 values first before dividing by 500. Right? So if I omitted these brackets, the first thing that the program would do, based on PEMDAS rules, is to do division. Right? And so it would take E and divide it by 500. But we want to take A minus E and divide that by 500. So that's the purpose of these brackets, that we want to do this subtraction first. Okay, next step, create the program. All right. So it's going to look like this. First things first, we read the values from the user. Okay, this is step 1. We got to account for all the input that's required from the user. So as mentioned in the in the exercise, first step is prompt the user to input the elevation, and we store that as E of the desired location in feet. So enter the elevation in feet. We convert that to a float first, and then we store it in E. The second step is pretty much the same, except we're asking the user for the temperature at ground level, which we store as G. So we are asking for that here, converting it to a float, storing it in G. Then the third step is to do the same thing, but this time we're asking for the altitude above sea level, and we're storing that as a float in a variable called A. Okay, next step, we run the calculation and store the result in a variable called T. So T equals G minus A minus E over 500. And then the last step could be print the temperature, temperature at A feet is T degrees Celsius. Okay. So the last part of the problem is to use our program and determine the air temperature over the town of Simcoe. And it gives us all the specifications that we need. So let's run the program. And it asks us to enter the elevation in feet. And so we've been told to enter 735. So 735. Enter the temperature at ground level. So it says here that the temperature at ground level is 28.5 degrees Celsius. It's 28.5. And then it asks us to enter the desired altitude above sea level. So it says altitude of 5,500 feet above sea level. So we'll put 5,500. And the result is the program tells us the temperature at 5,500 feet is 18.97 degrees Celsius.